Welcome everybody to the breakout session on centering racial, social, and ecological justice in a year of service. My name is Fumi Tosu. I'm the Director of Recruitment and Engagement at the Jesuit Volunteer Corps Northwest. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Zaina.
Hello, thank you, Fumi. Hi, everybody. My name is Zaina Abusada, and I'm the full-time recruiter at Jesuit Volunteer Corps Northwest here. And just to give you a short introduction of what JVC Northwest is, we are a postgraduate service organization based in the Pacific Northwest in Montana, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. And we are serving in 20 different types of service in different types of communities. And we send students there after they've graduated to participate in a year of service surrounded by 4 values, which are community, social and ecological justice, simple living, and spirituality and reflection. So that's a little bit about who we are. And today we're talking about centering racial, social, and ecological justice in a world that might not be a pillar of this justice. So what we want to talk to you today about is a little bit of how service organizations have both contributed to that and also what we need to do to include diversity, equity, and inclusion in service organizations and how we at JVC Northwest are doing that. So I'd like to share my screen with all of you and talk a little bit about the history of service and DEI work. All right, here we go. So, let's see. Don't know if I can, it's not letting me move. Well, we shall try again. Share screen again. Let's try this time. Okay, here we go. So, talking about a history of injustice in either domestic volunteer programs or just in the idea of service in the United States in general. So, domestic volunteer groups have often been, in their history, both anti-Indigenous and anti-Black, Indigenous, and people of color centered in terms of erasing culture and tradition from Black, Native, and Brown communities. And unfortunately, we have to come to the recognition that faith-based organizations have also been a part of that history. With that, we have to acknowledge that the idea of white savior complex and how it's harmed communities in which volunteer organizations have served. And to do this, we have to know that when you're coming into a community as a guest of that community from the outside, it's not necessarily that folks have malicious intentions. It's just that there is a lot of history behind just harmful things that have happened. So coming into a space as not part of a community, particularly as potentially a white person, making sure that you're doing service and walking with folks equally and not coming in to have a mentality of saving anyone or proselytizing to anyone, that you're there truly to do the work with them and meet folks where they're at. So how is the best way to start repairing this past history of injustice that folks have seen from the volunteer world? Well, telling our stories ethically is one of the best ways to do that and start repairing that past history of injustice. Telling your stories ethically means you center around the strength of a person. You don't take away their agency. You don't take away their autonomy. And you lift them up in a way that gives them advocacy for their own story and their own voices within the context of the volunteer year. In terms of what your fellow volunteers might be, there are also, of course, Black, Indigenous, and people of color volunteers. So what does that look like? That looks like not like being in solidarity with them. That means sharing experience with them, having them be open, having you be open to learning more about those folks and helping those volunteers feel safe and comfortable in an environment that might have been very dominated, like in history, by folks who were white or white passing, and just wanting to make sure that both the people that we are serving and the folks that we are serving with all have equal opportunity. So thinking about and going on, we'll talk a little bit later about how JVC Northwest is talking about what BIPOC experience looks like in the volunteer experience. But first and foremost, knowing that telling stories ethically and creating this space of letting Indigenous folks and Black and Brown communities tell their own stories is what's really important. And so now we'll go on to the next portion.
Thanks, Zaina. So then the question for those of us wanting to engage in service becomes, how do we reframe our motivation and expectations for service? As a white person or a cis male, how can I shift away from that white savior complex that Zaina was talking about? There's often a deep desire among those who want to do service to make the world a better place. That's one of those basic things that God implants in our souls to say, like, hey, go out and make this a more beautiful place. And in itself, it's a wonderful, holy desire. But the question is, how do we make the world a more beautiful place? And the traditional white savior model answer has been to fix problems. And that's what we want to shift away from. What if there was another approach? What if the way to make the world a more beautiful place was, for example, by learning to see differently, or by undoing oppression in my own life, or by uprooting my own internalized obedience to a system that's inherently exploitative? Those of us who are white or male or heterosexual or cisgendered or Christian, any of these dominant identities in the United States, go into service with internalized cultural narratives about who has power, agency, knowledge, and expertise. When I entered service, I was no exception. So I want to tell you a story from the years that I was part of a Catholic worker community in San Jose, California. We worked with women and children on the streets, inviting them in to live with us as they were transitioning out of homelessness. And I was part of this community for 6 years. Unconsciously, I went into this work with assumptions about myself and about the women I was supposed to be serving. I've never been homeless, I thought, so I must have done something right. I must know something about how not to become homeless and how to get out of homelessness. That unconscious thought, combined with my internalized patriarchy, resulted in me establishing rules and exercising power in a way that replicated the worst of what society models. So I established regimented rules about being out of the house from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. because homeless women had to be encouraged to go look for work, because they couldn't possibly take their own initiative to do that. I created quotas for the number of job searches they had to perform each week, set deadlines for when they needed to move out to, quote unquote, motivate them to get their lives back together more quickly. As I look back, I ask myself, how much of that was motivated by the negative stereotypes perpetuated by society? An attitude of blaming the victim, a subtle sense of superiority that I somehow knew better than them what's best for their lives. I was graciously helping them. If they wanted my help, they needed to follow my program. I also had other motivations too. I was in charge of fundraising for the Catholic worker, and so I wanted my program to be successful so I could feel good and get more funding. Thankfully, I was able to gradually shift my approach, thanks to some friends who had the courage to confront me and a long process of undoing patriarchy in my own heart, which is something I'm still working on. As a result of this process, we started shifting power in real ways to the women we were serving. We no longer required them to transition out of the Catholic worker in 3 months or 6 months, but supported them as long as they needed. We gave them each their own house key, allowed anyone to come and go as they pleased, and we let them take the lead in setting goals and shifted to a more supporting role. The result? Well, the women who came to us found their way forward, each in their own way. And we as Catholic workers were no longer in the lead. Our role had shifted to holding and anchoring a welcoming and safe space for the women through things like family dinners, deep listening, and relationship building. And given that safe space, slowly the women could begin to find their own way. And so at JVC Northwest, when we talk about service, we're looking for people who are willing to grow in a particular equity-focused way. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. What we're looking for are people who want to learn to listen deeply, to recognize their own biases, privileges, power, motivations, and undo that internalized oppression. We recognize that everybody is on a journey. And so we're not looking for people who have arrived, who know everything about diversity and equity and inclusion. But what we are looking for are people who see service as an opportunity to learn to do these things in the context of a spiritually grounded, intentional community. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Zaina.
Thanks, Fumi. All right. Now kind of going into branching off of what Fumi was saying about what we're looking for in terms of service and how we connect everything. I want to talk a little bit about the intersection between racial justice, social justice, and ecological justice. How those three are one and the same, and they can't really exist without each other. So before that, before I get into how they intersect and how they may cross, I really want to share with you all a story of what it means to kind of have those three come together in both your life, both in service life and in normal life, in personal life. So I'll tell you a bit about who I am and why it made sense in terms of my own volunteer experience. So my first year with JVC Northwest, I was sent to a really small town in southeastern Montana. It was on the indigenous reservation of the Northern Cheyenne and Crow people. And being a person of color myself, definitely came to a crossroads of how I experienced my year versus how my white community mates experienced their year. And how the social issues of the reservation and the community that we lived in really impacted all of our years. So something that you might have known in terms of an ecological justice issue is something called environmental racism, which is a crossroads of specifically targeting marginalized folks in a way that is ecologically unjust, so taking away natural resources or land, or just providing unsafe quality of ecology around them. And on Indigenous reservations, of course, there's a lot of anti-Indigenous like issues, things like that going on in terms of quality of land and scarcity of resources. So when we lived and moved to Montana as an organization, as a JV community, we realized through listening to the community members around us and the elders and all the folks that were our new neighbors and folks that we were serving with, we quickly realized that what most Indigenous reservations experience is what's called a food desert, which is a scarcity of resources, and specifically with food and hunger justice because of the location of crossroads of being very rural, being in a place where the land doesn't provide much, the land is not suited to agriculture. And then in terms of just getting things, like they might be several hours away. So this was at a crossroads for me because I was seeing this injustice and we were all living it because we were in the community. We experienced that injustice as well because we were living in solidarity with all of these folks and experiencing food injustice and realizing that that leads not only to the scarcity of resources, but a lot of public health concerns and other things that come from that. And so it's this crossroad of, yes, this is ecologically like injustice motivated because of this resource, but then you also see that it's a social justice issue in connection. You see that it's a racial justice issue in connection because out on the reservation, it's targeting Indigenous communities. If you're in an urban area and there's a food desert, it might be targeting minority communities that live in low-income areas. So kind of going through my experience living in that community, I saw how these kind of intertwined firsthand. For my own self, it was an interesting crossroads because I was this minority within a minority in terms of my service there. I'm not native to the United States, but I am a person of color who hails from the Middle East and very much was able to relate to my students and the folks that I was serving with on the reservation in terms of issues of land and land reclamation and things like resource scarcity, water potency, all of these ecological issues that are coinciding were issues that I had experienced at some point in my life through my experience as the particular person of color that I am. So being able to relate and understand why ecological justice was so important to the service of social and racial justice was super important for me to spread, even if I didn't have the exact same experience as the folks that I was serving with. I was able to relay a little bit easier and educate and help educate my fellow community mates who were white or coming into this space with more privilege. I was able to kind of be more relational in terms of the community I was serving with. Of course, I'm not part of the Indigenous community, so I was also a guest on the land and had that privilege of being a volunteer myself in that space. But there was a relational aspect that I was able to create community in order to bond us together, in order to see these three justice issues come together. So with that, I'll share a little bit of my screen again in terms of talking about what the intersection between these three things are. Okay, so resume. Okay, so kind of what I said before is no social and ecological justice can happen without racial justice, as systemic racism is really ingrained into all parts of society. And like I said with the example of environmental racism, it's one of the crossroads we can look at for the three issues. These are the lived experiences of folks today. You see things like, for example, water. That was happening on Indigenous reservation, a lack of water and water potency. You have that with like just Indigenous issues that happen in terms of like what land is viable or not. You see water issues in urban areas, folks who have to deal with water not being safe, even here. Just really any community that you find in the United States, you really can find an issue of water justice and the idea that water is life and why that's so important. So you see these intersections everywhere. And at JVC Northwest, we really want to specify how important that is. How important that you realize that we're all fighting for social justice, of course. That's one of our main pillars. We add ecological justice onto that because we believe they're one and the same, because particularly us here in the Pacific Northwest have such a fragile ecosystem that we want to protect. And specifically, we are on Indigenous land, and that land is something that we wish to protect in order to highlight really real Indigenous issues. And then bundling that all together, racial justice, because everything is so grounded and ingrained in racial justice and systemic racism. We realize that social and ecological justice throughout the country, as it's targeting marginalized communities, intersects with this justice. So to work for one is to work for all three. And whether you're coming in to a volunteer space with white privilege, with patriarchal privilege, with gender and sexuality privilege, it's very much something that you need to keep in mind, that when you are doing this work, when you're centering it around this DEI work, and you're doing this experience because you want to be helping, because you are filled with this purpose, that because you are called to do so, that is wonderful. But definitely keeping in mind that these three things, racial, social, and ecological justice, intersect, and they need to be fought for and worked for equally while you are in this position and walking with folks. So with that, and keeping in mind that these are the communities that JVC Northwest serves, we want to share a little bit about what we're doing and kind of our part of how this organization works toward diversity, equity, and inclusion, and melding together those three points of racial, social, and ecological justice. And I'll pass it along to Fumi to share a little bit about that. Thank you all.
Thanks, Zaina. So I'm going to share my screen one more time. As Zaina mentioned, social and ecological justice are one of the four core values and pillars of JVC Northwest. But I think for a long time, as a white-dominated and white-majority organization, we had a blind spot in terms of racial justice and equity. So I want to focus a little bit on that piece for the remainder of our time together. As I said, JVC Northwest is still a white-majority, white-dominated organization. And as such, we still have a long ways to go. At the same time, especially over the last 3 to 5 years, we've taken quite a few steps towards moving in the direction we want to be going in. So that, as Zaina said, racial justice and ecological and social justice really go together in our organization. First, looking at our Jesuit volunteers, the AmeriCorps members, JV AmeriCorps members who come and serve with us, we've significantly increased formation at orientation and throughout the year on racial identity in collaboration with outside groups like the Krista Foundation. We now provide a curriculum developed specially for JVC Northwest called Justice Starts at Home, which is a series of about 30 or 40 different activities that JV communities can do to delve deeper into the intersection of racial, ecological, and social justice. We host identity-based meetups at retreats. So those would include white accountability groups, as well as BIPOC, LGBTQIA+ groups, groups for folks living with disabilities. In addition, we provide 2 retreats a year specifically for our BIPOC JVs, and have instituted a mentoring program where former volunteers with specific identities get paired with JVs with those same or similar identities, so that we provide that extra level of support for JVs who might be coming in with a more marginalized identity. JV Encore is our program for adults 50 and older, and that community has committed to spend 25% of their community time focusing on equity and inclusion. And organizationally, for our board and staff, over the last few years, we've developed a diversity, equity, and inclusion rubric for hiring of staff. Everybody on the staff participates in individual and group training based on something called the Intercultural Development Inventory, with the support of a trained consultant. Part of that work is ongoing staff development through small group meetings that happen every other week. We just last year completed an external evaluation of race and equity in our organization, focused specifically on the JV experience of equity. And we're currently undergoing a second external evaluation that's focused on community impact and impact on partner agencies. We'll take all of that, and we're preparing for a major strategic planning on racial justice and equity with the board of directors and the aid of our research results. So that's just a window into the steps that JVC Northwest has been taking over the last 3+ years to shift us from our complicity in what Zaina started off this conversation with, our complicity in supporting that white savior complex, and trying to shift away from that into a healthier, holistic view of service. So thank you so much for joining us for this breakout session. It was great to be with you in this virtual setting. Zaina, did you want to just say goodbye?
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. We hope that you are learning and continue to learn, and feel free to ask us any questions that you like along the way. And we wish you the best in this virtual world, and we hope to see you very soon. Thank you.
Take care, and yeah, send us a message.